We are just learning a judge in New York overseeing Donald Trump's upcoming hush money criminal trial has hit the former president with a gag order. CBS News investigative reporter Graham Cates has been covering this and many of the other cases for us. He's on the phone with us right now. Graham, thanks so much for taking the time. So talk to us, first of all, what exactly is in the gag order from what you've read?
Sure. So this limits what former President Donald Trump can say in the lead up to this trial, which begins on April 15th, about foreseeable witnesses in the case. So that includes his former lawyer, Michael Cohen, who's an ardent critic and who Trump frequently lashes out at. In the lead up to the trial, this should prevent him from making social media posts about witnesses like Michael Cohen, as well as members of the court staff or the district attorney Alvin Bragg's staff, who also Trump frequently targets. And it's worth noting that in this gag order is also a limitation on what can be said about family members of all of these people. And just this morning, Trump mentioned the judge's daughter in a social media post. He's actually frequently mentioned her because she works for a democratically aligned consulting firm. But presumably under this gag order, he is now barred from doing so.
You know, you mentioned maybe, the gag order covers or extends beyond the direct individuals to their family members. But I wonder, since you mentioned Michael Cohen gave a statement in which he said that knowing Donald Trump as well as he does, he expects him to defy the gag order by employing others within his circle to do his bidding regardless of consequence. We're seeing the statement right there on screen. So I wonder, would Michael Cohen or others be protected by the gag order if, as Cohen says, Trump has other people making statements for him? Would the gag order be of value in that case?
So the exact wording of the order is that he's barred from, it's, quote, making or directing others to make public statements about known or reasonably foreseeable witnesses. So Cohen appears to be wrong about that, at least if they could prove it, right? If some person who supports Donald Trump says something about anyone, that person's not necessarily violating a gag order. But if there's some evidence that Trump directed them to, that there's a coordinated effort tied to Trump, that's a whole other matter.
I see. So it is extended to comments that he could make in private. Graham, I'm also curious, just to go back to basics, how does a gag order actually work, or what's the point of it, rather? How does it affect the case when somebody, speaks beyond what the judge finds acceptable?
Well, we're in a really crucial time before the trial right now. A very large group of potentially hundreds of people who are potential jurors in this case are about to receive their notices that on April 15th, they are to show up at Manhattan's criminal court. And right now, what the judge is trying to do is prevent them from being unduly influenced in the lead up to this case. So there's two things. And then also, he mentioned that there is a real security fear for people who are targeted. And the filing requesting this order, the Manhattan DA cited examples from other cases where either jurors themselves were targeted by supporters of Trump or court staff were targeted by Trump himself. And the judge said that those examples led to real-world security issues for many of the people involved. So there's a twofold thing. One, trying to keep people from being influenced by public statements by this very, very well-known, well-covered person in the public eye, and also trying to keep everyone involved safe, not necessarily from him, but from followers who might act on what they think he's trying to say about people.
Graham, some of Trump's grievances when it comes to all of these cases against him, he says, look, if I have to be in court, that eats into my campaigning time. Therefore, he and his team have figured out a way to use the courthouse and sometimes even the courtroom as a means to continue campaigning. Yesterday, he left the courthouse and we saw him standing in front of a bunch of American flags, and it looked like just a campaign speech. And so I wonder how the gag orders affect that. Can he continue to do that as long as he doesn't speak about specifics of the case? How much can he keep doing that?
Yeah, and he can even talk about the case itself. He's not barred from talking about the allegations. During the trial, there's a pen of press cameras set up in the hallway right outside the courtroom. And during the trial, he can walk out during every break, before and after every day of proceedings, and talk about the case itself, talk about the evidence shown during the trial. He can decide not to talk about the trial and talk about Joe Biden or whatever is coming up in his campaign. But he's barred from talking about the witnesses in the case. He's barred from talking about people who work in the district attorney's office beyond Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, and from the court staff and their families.
I see. Graham Cates, I know you will be covering all of it as you have for so many months. Thank you.
Thank you very much.